Hello, AP European History Scholars. Review sheet here for Unit 14, and this is Europe at the turn of the 20th, 21st century. This will be our last unit before we review for the AP Euro exam. The review sheet, hopefully this isn't too random for you. Looking from top to bottom, the Arab oil embargo of 1973 and the 70s recession. 1970s is a time of stagnation in much of the world's economy here, at least the Western world, the United States, certainly in the Nixon, Ford, Carter years. And then in Europe, you have relatively high unemployment driven by high oil prices, and you have correspondingly high inflation. And largely this is because the Europeans, along with the Americans, supported the Israelis during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which Israel won, but the Arabs organized OPEC, which is the oil producing and exporting countries, and they jacked up their oil prices. So this is a year of sort of economic regress. The social welfare state, this comes really into existence after the Second World War ends, and this is a nickname given for European nations that voluntarily, democratically pay higher taxes, and in return they expect and the government provides generous social services such as free education, but in Europe would be subsidized or free college, government supported health care, paid vacations, pensions, very generous unemployment. Similar to what we have in the United States, but on a much higher level. For example, paid vacation, something that we don't have here in the US, but you do have this in Europe. Things like paid maternity leave as well. Why do these exist? Well, during the war, Europeans are used to interventionist and strong government, and many of these benefits are passed to lessen the appeal of communism, and there's strong traditions of unionism and socialist, democratic socialist parties and Christian democratic parties, which promote the public well-being through government intervention, through government activism, something much more than we have in the United States. Problems facing the current social welfare state, well, less taxpayers and rising costs as you have an aging population and increasing debt. The creator of the British welfare state is Clement Attlee and the Labour Party, and after World War II, people who had suffered through the war now want the government to work just as aggressively for pursuing equality and economic equality. And you have the nationalization, which is the government takeover of private business, some private businesses, and namely the National Health Service becomes an agency of the state. Coal mines, the Bank of England, electric companies, the National Railroad, iron and steel mills, these things are taken over by the state, and the state is going to pay for quite a bit of public housing. Margaret Thatcher and the British social welfare state, fast forward to the mid to late 1980s, and you have Margaret Thatcher attacking this welfare state, which has created a certain amount of economic stagnation in Great Britain, and she's going to sell off the coal mines and sell off the steel mills and privatize public housing. And she's not going to touch the NHS, but her goal is to reduce the power of the unions, which had gotten very powerful, and to limit the right to strike and to pursue privatization rather than nationalization. And after Margaret Thatcher, after her years, England is going to boom and has a relatively prosperous economy compared to many comparative European states at this time period. Existentialism is this idea, that this philosophy that there is no God, there is no purpose in the universe, that we create our own purpose and we create our own meaning. And two proponents of this are Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre. Second Vatican Council is a meeting of Catholic bishops that meets from 1962 off and on to 1965, and they're addressing relations of the modern Catholic Church with the modern world. And some characteristics or some things that come out of this council is the support for dialogue with other religions rather than sort of adversarial relations. The Catholic Church starts calling Protestants, instead of heretics, separated brethren. But there's no change in doctrine. Key doctrines that divided the Reformers during the Reformation, they're not changed. You do have, one of the big changes, though, is the allowing of teaching and worship in the vernacular. Latin is pretty much dropped from the common liturgy. Priests face the congregation, some small things, no longer back to the congregation. And for moral issues, there are not changes on abortion, on homosexuality, on the requirement that priests be male and that they be celibate. These things do stay the same. Islam in Europe in the 21st century, well, as immigrants move into Europe from North Africa and from the Middle Eastern Arab countries, coming with this is Islam as a religion. And you have these waves of immigrants from places like Turkey and, again, Arab countries, the Middle East, North Africa, and especially France. It's estimated that perhaps 10% of France's population may be, at least nominally, Muslim. And one of the problems here is assimilation into a society that's not used to having a lot of immigrants, let alone not having non-Christian immigrants. There's discrimination, and there's cultural clashes, things with the headscarves and the burqa and the chador, women covering themselves. And you have the issue of terrorism. You have the issue of terrorists coming in as immigrants, and the native-born. The children of many of these Muslim groups have become radicalized. And if you've been following the news here, this is being recorded in the spring of 2017, but you've had attacks on priests, attacks on Jewish centers, attacks on public gatherings in Germany and Sweden and France and Great Britain and Spain over the last decade or so from radical Muslims. The Syrian refugee crisis after 2014, after the rebellion against the dictator Assad, you have millions of refugees that have fled, many to neighboring countries such as Jordan and Turkey, but many have tried to make their way and have made their way to Europe. And this has created, again, this crisis of culture clash, both religion. Many of these immigrants are illiterate, are impoverished, they don't speak the local language, and this is a huge assimilation problem in Europe. And one thing this has led to, it's been argued, is the Brexit, the pulling out of the European Union that began with the 2016 vote in Great Britain. And part of this is the worry that Britain is going to be obligated to take many hundreds of thousands, perhaps, of these refugees, let alone immigrants. Many of these immigrants, have been learning English, and they don't want to go to France. They don't want to go to non-English speaking European countries. They want to go to England. And Britain voted to leave the EU, and it's in the process now in the spring of 2017 of negotiating this exit here. Some problems here are policies of residency of Brits who are living on the continent, and many hundreds of thousands of foreigners who are now living legally and working in Great Britain. Issues of trade, benefits and preferences, which may or may be lost here with the exit, and the share that Great Britain has of European Union debt. Marine Le Pen, again, as this is being recorded, there's going to be an election here at the end of April, which, if she's one of the candidates in an election in France, if she is in the top two without a clear majority, there's going to be a runoff in May. And her party is the National Front. And the National Front, it's a very patriotic nationalistic party that is, you might want to think of it equivalent of, have America First here under Trump and the Republicans. Well, this would be France First. A promise to end Muslim immigration, a promise to protect and revive French industry, and to have, like Great Britain, to have a vote on whether or not France should leave the EU. So Marine Le Pen is getting a lot of steam, a lot of energy from anger and frustration over this wave of immigrants that's adding to an already very large immigrant population from the Middle East. And again, there's been the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, the attack on the nightclub, the Muslim terrorists driving, I don't know if it was a cement truck or a big monster truck down the Riviera Boulevard, and hundreds of people have been killed in recent years from Muslim attacks in France. Changes for women by the end of the 20th century. Well, women going end of the 20th century, going into the 21st century, have entered the professions. They've entered the workforce. They've entered the government at the highest ranks here. Margaret Thatcher may be the most famous European leader in the last 50 years. You have women receiving reproductive rights, the right to abortion, the right to contraception, later marriages. One problem coming out of this is lower birth rates. And by and large, Western Europeans are not replacing themselves. Part of the reason why immigrants are making their way to Europe, there are jobs. And this is a problem for paying for these generous welfare benefits. As the Europeans get older, needing more medical care, receiving their pensions, who's going to pay this? This is a problem that's hanging out there. Willy Brandt and Ostpolitik. Willy Brandt is a late 20th century post-World War II leader in West Germany who pursued a policy of détente with East Germany and seeking to reduce tensions here, sort of corresponding, maybe a synthesis type of parallel here would be Nixon's intention to reduce tensions with China, with the Soviet Union, with his policy of détente. German reunification. In 1990, Germany is reunited. This would be West and East Germany, and a very expensive proposition here, replacing one of the most valuable currencies in the world, the German Deutschmark, with the sort of quasi-funny money East German mark. And money has gone to developed East Germany, whose industry basically overnight became obsolete. And largely the West Germans have pulled this off. Germany now is a very wealthy, prosperous country with problems in the eastern zone, higher unemployment and more closed-up industries. But the problem here at this time period was to unite these two former adversaries, and basically East Germany was swallowed and became part of what would really be West Germany. Perhaps it's a thought here, synthesis parallel you could make here is the creation of modern Germany in the year 1870 through 71 through the work of Otto von Bismarck with some of these wars with neighboring countries, Denmark, Austria, and with France, of course, Willy Brandt and Helmut Kohl. In 1990, there's no wars here, putting Germany back together. That would be a contrast. Sequence of European economic unification, 1951 with European Coal and Steel Community. You have those original 6 members, which would be France and Italy, West Germany, and the Benelux countries of Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. 1957, 6 years later, the Treaty of Rome forms the EEC, the European Economic Community, and this is a customs union. The goal is to make it easier for the flow of trade goods back and forth between countries. And finally, we have 1993, the EU, the European Union, and in 2002, the European Union now has issued the euro. Many countries, the majority, not all countries, England would be, or Great Britain would be an example of a country that kept the pound, yet is part of the EU, pulling out of it. But the euro is going to replace the lira, is going to replace the French franc, is going to replace the Deutschmark, is going to replace the Spanish peseta and the escudo in Portugal and so forth. The Maastricht Treaty is the treaty that created this economic and monetary union. And today, again, there's 19 out of the 28 member states of the EU are using the euro. And this is a currency which is, you can use across borders here. The Schengen area is an area of free movement. Immigrants, you can move from one country. If you're a member of the EU, you can move from one country to the other. You can move to live, you can move to retire, you can move to work. And this has been a problem here. Some countries have temporarily set up border restrictions, which are not supposed to be there because of these waves of immigrants. In the last year, about 1 million immigrants have been welcomed into West Germany. Angela Merkel. The main 2 goals of the European Economic Union, starting in 1951 through the development of the EEC and the EU, is to unite these countries in a permanent state of peace and cooperation. But the big ones are peace and prosperity. Peace and prosperity are the goals, and it's been largely successful. Why has Turkey been excluded from the EU? Well, Turkey's not fully democratic. Turkey persecutes the Kurds. Turkey denies that they slaughtered 1.5 million Armenians, let alone another million Syrian and Greeks, in what's an act of genocide. Turkey invaded in the 70s the island of Cyprus, an independent European country, and currently still occupies the northern part of Cyprus. And to boot, Turkey is Muslim, and this is an issue with this flood of Muslims that are flowing legally and illegally into Europe. The effect of nationalism in Russia after 1991. Remember, by 1991, all of the republics pull out; they secede from the Soviet Union, which collapses, and since then, Putin has, following Boris Yeltsin, Putin has worked hard to promote nationalism and Russian interests around the world to rebuild the military of Russia. And there's been a war, actually two wars, but really one ongoing war starting in 1991 when Chechnya, now this is down in the Caucasus, this is a Muslim area kind of near where Georgia and Azerbaijan and Armenia would be, or are. Chechnya has declared their independence, and Russia has fought for decades here, an ongoing insurgency. About 100,000 have died in Chechnya, and that's still sort of a hot spot. But on top of this, Putin invaded, how do we say this, little green men, the Russian soldiers without markings, took over Ukraine in 2014 and very quickly had a plebiscite. And the majority of Ukraine are about, I'm thinking if I remember my numbers right, about 2/3 of Ukrainians are Russian nationals, Russian speakers. They voted in a plebiscite which was allowed, an election allowed by Putin. They voted to join Russia. So Ukraine, which is not adjacent, is not contiguous with Russia, is part of Russia. And then in 2015, the Russians have supported a breakaway separatist movement in eastern Ukraine, which has a high Russian ethnic and Russian language speaking population. There's kind of a low boil war going on there still. The Russians have shipped military supplies. There are those little green men, the Russian soldiers, who are not marked officially as Russian soldiers, and they've been equipping and aiding these Ukrainian separatists, these Russian Ukrainian separatists, against the independent nation of Ukraine. And this area is called the Donbass, D-O-N-B-A-S-S, capital D-O-N-B-A-S-S. This is this region that's adjacent to Russia, that is eastern Ukraine. Nationalism in Great Britain and in Spain, again, Great Britain voted to pull out of the EU in the summer of 2016, and these negotiations are taking place now as I'm doing this upload. In the spring of 2017, Scotland, I think it's 2 years back here, voted 55% to 45% to stay in the EU, but there was a vote there. There was a vote in Scotland to allow the Scots to decide whether or not they wanted to leave Great Britain. And the Scottish Nationalist Party is promising another vote in the near future. In Spain, in Catalonia, that's the region up in the northeast where Barcelona is, 2014, there was a non-binding referendum where 81% of the population voted for independence. And the pro-independence party that is in power has promised another vote on whether Catalonia should pull out and become an independent state. The government of Spain fully opposes this. They're not like the British government, not like the London government, which gave the Scots their shot. The government of Spain says they will oppose this, so that's kind of in a limbo. The idea of the Green movement, the Green parties are pro-environment, ecological parties to protect the environment, and they have a presence in many European countries. Americanization refers to American influence and the sense of cultural loss and American domination in areas like music and TV and films and food and clothing and language, that American culture is kind of swamping native culture. Algeria after World War II. Remember, when World War II ends, Algeria's population is about 20% white French blood. It's not the native Arab population. That's the other 80%. And a war breaks out in Algeria, and France fights hard to hold on to Algeria. About 35,000 French die between 1954, when the independence movement begins, and de Gaulle, who's going to come to power, is going to allow an election among the Algerians, and in 1962 they do vote for independence and to break off from France. And about 800,000 white Algerians, they're called the Pied Noir, the Blackfeet, they pull out and they move back to France. And as far as the bottom here of the review sheet here, Simone de Beauvoir and the Second Sex, this is a feminist manifesto by this French lady. And her argument is for women to have the full freedom of men, they must deny maternity itself. Maternity and the family are tools of patriarchal oppression, and she's a proponent of sexual and reproductive as well as social and economic freedom. And she says that society wrongly teaches women to be passive and to limit their freedom. And a sort of a synthesis, perhaps, just a thought here. The corresponding person in American history would be in the early 1960s, Betty Friedan and the Feminine Mystique, this argument that men are brainwashing women, especially young women, to be mothers and to be wives and to stay at home and to cook and to clean and to raise children. So there you have it. These are some thoughts here on Europe at the turn of the century and Europe in the early 21st century in particular. So study hard, study smart, study early, and best luck to you all, my students.